And today we're going to be talking about the current crisis in Ethiopia, particularly in the Oromia region. Since last month, as you know, the Ethiopian government has declared a state of emergency. The Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn resigned from his position, and shortly after then, the state of emergency was declared. But today we're going to be talking a little bit more about U.S. foreign policy in that region and how it's, how it was shaped over, the past 25 years since the EPRDF came to power. So we're going to be joined here by the Ambassador David Shin, former ambassador to Ethiopia from 1996 to 1999. So David Shin, thank you for joining us today.
Happy to join you.
Perfect. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about your role as the Director of East African Affairs for the State Department in the early 90s. That was right after the Cold War. The government there, the Ethiopian government had just recently come to power. There was a lot of, changes, political changes going on in the region. And, your sort of role was to shape policy in the region for, the Clinton administration. So what were your priorities going into that? Were they mostly economic, security? What were your priorities?
Well, keep in mind that as Director for East African and Horn of African Affairs, that also included Somalia. And during that time frame, in the early 1990s, Somalia was the issue that co-opted most of my time, much more so even than Ethiopia. So I was focused at least 50% of my time on the situation in Somalia. It was during the international intervention there. And needless to say, whenever you have American troops on the ground, as we did in Somalia, it's going to consume you. And in terms of the Ethiopian component of my portfolio, we obviously were following very closely the development of the new EPRDF government in Ethiopia under Meles Zenawi. And we're not only interested in developing a close relationship with that government, but we're watching very closely the degree to which the EPRDF is showing a willingness to democratize, to improve the human rights situation, particularly after the previous regime, which had a very bad reputation on human rights and democratization. So we were following closely developments in Ethiopia, and also Ethiopia's role in the regional security situation. Ethiopia was working closely at that time with the United States in dealing with problems that the U.S. had, particularly in Sudan, and also Eritrea and Uganda were part of that effort.
Okay. And so, how did that relationship grow to become something that the U.S. saw as a strategic interest in maintaining? Is it something that happened right away? Or?
No, it developed over time. I think the security interests were always important and always there, but they became far more important, especially in the period after the bombing of the American embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam in 1998. And then after that, with the bombings of the the World Trade Center in New York in 2001, that really shifted the emphasis of American policy more towards counterterrorism and security concerns. At the same time, in terms of what was going on in Ethiopia, the outbreak of conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea in May of 1998 changed significantly the equation with which the United States interacted with Ethiopia and Eritrea particularly. My tour in Ethiopia as ambassador was really in two parts. From the summer of 1996 until May of 1998, it was a fairly normal ambassadorship where I was focusing on essentially trying to improve relations between the United States and Ethiopia, and we were having some success with that. Following the outbreak of conflict with Eritrea in May of 1998, everything changed. At that point, the United States was basically treading water in the Horn of Africa because we were consumed with the Ethiopian-Eritrean conflict, bringing it to an end. We tried very hard to bring it to an end, involving people all the way up to President Clinton at the time. Obviously, that did not succeed. It only came to an end later on, and more with the intervention of the African Union, and particularly the role that Algeria played. But once that conflict broke out, I devoted almost all of my time to dealing either with that or finding that I wasn't making an awful lot of success on that issue. I focused my personal attention to trying to help combat the HIV/AIDS pandemic in Ethiopia, because that was a neutral topic. It was something that the Ethiopian government could agree with, and the U.S. was willing to fund and support. Unlike the Ethiopia conflict, where Ethiopia thought we were being one-sided on behalf of Eritrea, and Eritrea thought we were being one-sided on behalf of Ethiopia. So we managed to irritate both countries in the process.
Okay. And so when you started your role in '96, I mean, what were your, you said that you were, doing a lot of humanitarian work with HIV. Did you really notice any issues internally in Ethiopia? And did the embassy really get involved in Ethiopian internal issues at that time?
Well, it depends how you define internal issues. I suppose the short answer to the question is yes, we did to some extent. The one area that I devoted a lot of time to was trying to improve the situation for the private press and journalists who were not part of the government institutions. And I took a certain amount of criticism for that from the government. I think there was a feeling that we were being too supportive of the free press, which frankly I would argue was somewhat freer at that time than it is even today. Not that it was all that free at that time, it wasn't, but I think the situation was better. There actually were newspapers in Fanaramo, for example, that were reasonably well received around the country. They didn't have a wide readership, but they were there, they existed. You had other indigenous media that would occasionally be outspoken. Most of that is pretty much ended. So we tried to be helpful on that score in terms of training of the private press and the government, and members of the government press too. Quietly, we would encourage better human rights practices. We weren't outspoken about that, but behind the scenes we did work on that. And we worked to increase aid programs to Ethiopia. That was with some success. And I think we had a pretty successful aid program during the time that I was there. Now that started to come apart after the outbreak of war with Eritrea. Some of the programs were scaled back as a result of that conflict.
Yeah, you did mention that in the Oromia region, that a lot of the Oromo press was shut down, in that period of time, early to mid '90s. So, I mean, when you brought up those issues with the Ethiopian government, how receptive were they of them? And do you believe that you made any progress in that regard?
I'm not sure that we made any real progress. They remained open. They remained functional during the time that I was there. That's, I guess, the good news. The bad news is I don't think they made any real progress, particularly whether we had any role whatsoever in even helping to ensure that they remained available, remained functional. I'll never know, I suppose. Maybe we did, maybe we didn't. And in all fairness, the government did have some legitimate criticism of the private press in that it was not always responsible. I mean, there were reports that would come out of the private press that I knew for a fact were just either exaggerations or inaccurate. So it was hard because all you had to do was have a few bad stories and the government would say, see, the private press is not responsible. They would ignore the good stories, or the ones that were accurate or brought to light the problems in the country that needed to be dealt with. So it was a very narrow line, a very thin edge for us to follow, trying to be helpful to the private press on the one hand, but sometimes having to do so when the private press was occasionally its own worst enemy.
And at the time, the Oromia region, when the EPRDF came to power, there was a lot of conflict with the Oromo political groups such as the OLF. And from that conflict, a lot of people, civilians, were detained across the country, tens of thousands. Did the United States Embassy ever get involved in the issue of Oromo political detainees?
The embassy would get involved in the case of political detainees across the board. They weren't all Oromo. You're right in that most of them were Oromo, but there were others from other ethnic groups who were also caught up in this. We always had a problem in knowing what the numbers were. There was always some dispute as to how many exactly were in detention, but the numbers were large, and everyone knew that. And again, largely quietly, behind the scenes, we would raise that. The one time it would come out publicly would be in the annual State Department Human Rights Report for Ethiopia, and all you have to do is go back and read those reports through the 90s and throughout this century also, and it will routinely reference those reports and indicate that that's a problem area. The Human Rights Report, whenever it came out in Ethiopia, would always be an issue because the government would be unhappy with it. It wouldn't be unusual that the ambassador or someone in the embassy would be called in and chided for quote mistakes unquote in the Human Rights Report. But there were efforts to try to deal with that situation in spite of the fact that we didn't always have good numbers to work with. Sometimes we had names, sometimes we didn't. Sometimes a very high-profile case we knew the background of very well, and we would raise that particular case, and there have been some successes with individual cases over the years. But with the vast majority of the people, it's really been up to the government of Ethiopia to decide whether it's going to release them or not, as they have done fairly recently, I gather.
Yeah, and so going to, the conflict with Eritrea, what was some of the major challenges that you experienced with that? And, can you get into that a little bit?
Well, the biggest challenge is the one that I already alluded to, and that is both the Ethiopians and the Eritreans, I think, were operating from a position that if you're not 100% for us, you're against us. And I think there's something in the culture of highland Ethiopians and Eritreans where the role of compromise is not very important. They want you to be all for or else. And we had an awful time on that because the American way of doing things is not to be 100% for, it's to try to seek the middle ground, to seek compromise. And to be very honest with you, we were not successful in doing that in the Eritrean-Ethiopian conflict, and as a result, as I indicated, we managed to alienate both the Ethiopian government and the Eritrean government for quite some period of time. I think subsequently the U.S.-Ethiopian relationship got back on track, particularly after my time, not during my time. The Eritrean-American relationship has never gotten back on track. It's been a very difficult relationship ever since May of 1998.
Okay. And of course, after that period, after the war with Eritrea had ended, there was a big U.S. policy shift, particularly after 9/11. The U.S. took more of a hands-on role in the region and saw the Ethiopian government as a strategic ally in the region. Did you see that as the right way to go about it? Sort of building that relationship with the Ethiopian government in order to maintain security in the region, in hindsight?
Yeah, keep in mind that I left the government in 2001, so most of that occurred after I left government, not to mention having left Ethiopia in 1999. I did see some of that developing in the period immediately after the bombings of the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. That had an impact throughout Africa and including in Ethiopia. And I started to see the beginning of increased attention being paid to cooperation on counterterrorism issues, but most of that happened after my time. Having said that, it's a topic that I have monitored from the standpoint of an academic. I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. government, obviously. And I think there have been occasions where we have relied too much on issues related to counterterrorism and paid not enough attention to some of the other important issues in the region, be they economic development or healthcare or human rights or democratization, a whole range of things that have sort of taken a back seat to the issue of counterterrorism. And the record on that has been sort of up and down. There have been times where I think our policy has been a little more balanced, other times when it's been less balanced. I'm afraid we may be getting into a period right now where it's heading back with a very excessive emphasis on counterterrorism, not just in the Horn, but throughout much of Africa. And I think one has to watch this very carefully. If you lose track of all of these other concerns that are of interest to both African governments and the African people, you can make some policy mistakes by overloading your policy in the counterterrorism basket. So I am a little bit worried about it at the moment, and I have been worried about it at times in the past, because it clearly is the first priority, and has been for quite some time, of the American government in much of Africa.
Yeah, so I mean, as you know, we mentioned as the Ethiopian government took more of a hands-on role, they began, training programs with the Ethiopian army, and a lot of, aid, which before that was primarily humanitarian, became, to take on more of a, in a military form. So since then, a lot of that military, with training with Ethiopian forces and, the equipment that the Ethiopian forces, received from the Americans has turned against, the Ethiopian population, particularly, in the Oromo region and the Amhara region where protests have happened. So do you think that that's something that should have been seen in hindsight? I mean,
let me make one clarification on that. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about to which briefing within the last month in which this subject came up. And it was pointed out to me that in 2017, for example, U.S. military assistance to Ethiopia amounted to $648,000. Now that's well under $1 million. In the scheme of things, that's not a very significant amount. Now, all of that $648,000, as I understand it, went to training and some logistical support. None of it went to lethal weapons, and the U.S. does not provide lethal weaponry to Ethiopia, and I don't believe it has in recent years, to the best of my knowledge. So we're talking about a pretty modest military commitment. Now, if you look at the American commitment to supporting Somalia, in Somalia, and supporting the Somali forces there, it's much greater. I don't know what the numbers are, but those are pretty significant dollar numbers. But in terms of the support to Ethiopian forces, it's really very, very limited on the military side. On the civilian side, it's very sizable, although most of that support goes to two things. It goes to dealing with health issues, HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and humanitarian food aid, but it's a very sizable program. But back to your basic point, should the United States even be providing $648,000 a year to the Ethiopian military? I think that's a justifiable program. in that we look to Ethiopia to be supportive of regional peacekeeping in Sudan and Somalia, South Sudan, and that Ethiopia has been helpful on counterterrorism. It's just not a huge investment. Whether any of that money has been abused or not, I don't know. I'm not on the ground. I can't determine that. But I think the key here is that we're talking about quite a modest program.
Well, the reason I brought that up is because, particularly in February of 2016, in the Western RC region where there was protests going on, activists on the ground, took pictures of U.S. Humvees that were being used by the Ethiopian government in order to transport troops to those areas and quell the protests. So the perception was that, the United States in some way played a role in financing the Ethiopian government and, enabling them to crack down on the protests. So that was the perception. How do you see it? Ambassador? So I think we have some connection issues going on right now. We'll just get those fixed in a moment, and we'll join you in a second.
Okay.
Sorry, Ambassador, we lost you there for a second. Did you hear my question?
Yeah, I did hear. Am I back on?
Yeah, you're back on. So,
okay.
how? Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know the specifics of the use of American Humvees in dealing with protests. I don't doubt that is true, but I just am not familiar with it. Humvees, of course, are not lethal equipment. They're transportation equipment, although I certainly would agree with you that the perception that would be given by that could very well be detrimental to the U.S., and it would be unfortunate from my optic that Humvees were used to counter any particular kind of protest. My guess is that equipment from a lot of other countries was also used. In fact, Ethiopia gets all of its lethal equipment from somewhere else, and it gets even a lot of its transportation equipment from other countries. So I suspect the U.S. role in this was probably fairly modest. But perceptions are perceptions, and you have to deal with them, and they're unfortunate. And assuming that this is the case, the Humvees were used, and I say I don't doubt that. That's something U.S. has to live with, and it's very difficult to explain away.
And you mentioned, with the current administration, there's less foreign aid being pumped into the region. Is that accurate?
It seems that it's headed in that direction. The Trump administration has called for a 33% reduction in the U.S. aid budget, and that clearly will mean cuts for the Horn of Africa, including Ethiopia. Now, as this is happening, though, and it's going on Capitol Hill literally as we speak here today, members of Congress are not agreeing to this. They are telling the new director of USAID, Ambassador Green, that this is not acceptable, a 33% cut, and they're not going to go along with it. Now, how it finally comes out, who knows? Maybe it'll be a 10% cut or a 15% cut. I don't think it will be a 33% cut, mainly because members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, are saying this is not acceptable. So there's a lot of pushback on this administration and in terms of what it's doing in Africa. But you're probably correct in that there will be some cutbacks that will also impact Ethiopia. And from my optic, this is unfortunate, but this is the world we live in today in Washington.
So how do you think the administration in Washington sees the current situation going on in Ethiopia with the state of emergency? I know that this now former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was there recently, and he did meet with officials there and sort of urged them to end the state of emergency. Do you think that U.S. involvement is going to go beyond that? How do you see that? Yeah,
well, the United States has made clear publicly and privately that it does not like the idea of the state of emergency, and the embassy and is on the Tillerson visit or the earlier visit when U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, visited Ethiopia. Whether there was any strong message that went forward or not on that occasion. What is important, I think, in terms of Ethiopian-American relations, is that the two most senior officials who have visited Africa from the Trump administration, Nikki Haley and Rex Tillerson, although he is no longer Secretary of State, both went to Ethiopia. The only other American official, senior American official to go to Africa was a very brief visit to Djibouti by our Secretary of Defense, and that's because we have a military base there. But this does underscore the attention and the importance that the U.S. Trump administration attaches to Ethiopia at a time when it seems to be giving very little attention to Africa. So I don't know whether that's good news or bad news, but at least there is a focus on Ethiopia in the Trump administration, although I don't see much else going on.
Do you foresee the U.S. role in the region declining? Rex Tillerson, while he was there, did make a comment about African nations accepting Chinese aid and not forfeiting their sovereignty by accepting Chinese money. So how do you see the U.S. role in the region? Is it declining?
I do see it as declining, not only in the region, but throughout the continent generally. I've been doing an enormous amount of research in the last 10 years on the China-Africa relationship. It's sort of a specialty area for me. And I have seen a distinct increase in Chinese influence across the continent, and particularly in a country like Ethiopia, and in neighboring countries like Kenya, Djibouti, South Sudan, Sudan. China is playing a very, very important role, and sometimes it's at the expense of the United States or the United States and the European Union countries. I'm also seeing a greater role being played in the region by some newer arrivals to the continent, countries like India, Turkey. Some of them are getting more engaged, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a negative way. But the number of players in the Horn of Africa from outside than when I served as ambassador in Ethiopia. During my time, it was sort of the European Union and the United States and not very many others. Today, it's a whole group of countries, and arguably a country like China has at least as much influence in Ethiopia today as does the United States. Maybe in the economic area, it has more influence than the United States. So a lot of these other players have to be taken into account. And how are they impacting the local situation? It's a very important issue.
So I guess I would like to ask you, like, if you were the director of East African Affairs today, how would your priorities and your outlook differ from when you were back in '93?
Well, the nature of the beast in Washington today is that you have to spend more attention on counterterrorism questions because they have the potential for impacting the United States directly. So that's a given. Nothing you can do about that. Having said that, I would, and I have been urging for years that we spend more time and attention on what the root causes are of extremist elements in Africa. I think sometimes we spend too much time trying to catch and capture and kill bad guys and not enough attention on why are these extremist groups arising in the first place. And what do you do in order to prevent them from rising? That is my biggest criticism of U.S. policy dealing with counterterrorism. And there are efforts to deal with root causes, but it's not proportional. More time needs to be spent on root causes and less time on capturing and killing bad guys. You've got to do both, but you can't exclude the root causes issue. I think we need to be better listeners across Africa, not just in the Horn of Africa. We need to listen not just to governments, but to people also, and take into account their views. I think one of the good initiatives of the Obama administration was the youth leadership effort and bringing youth leaders to Washington, trying to work with them to find out what their concerns are. And I hope that the Trump administration continues that program. I think it has so far, although it seems to have reduced it in scope. The focus on capacity building has always been a major part of American efforts in Africa, and I think it ought to continue. I think it's good. It has long-term benefits for the continent, building up the capacity of the health ministry, of the agriculture ministry. Those are things that the U.S. can do and can do well, and usually to the benefit of the African country. And then finally, the one thing we've always been superb at that I'm sure will continue under any administration is humanitarian assistance. The U.S. has always been the first with the most when it comes to emergency food aid and medical assistance and that sort of thing. We're good at it. We're generous, and we need to continue it, and I'm sure we will continue it. So that's not a change at all. That's just doing what we've done in the past and doing more of it, doing it better. But those would be, I guess, my major suggestions on how to move forward from here.
And I mean, like with a country like Ethiopia, a country of 100 million people, which has been ruled by a single party for the past 27 years, and is actually, ruled by a small elite group, which comes from, a minority ethnic group in the country. There's a lot of disenfranchisement. So would that go to what you were saying about the root cause? I mean, sort of engaging and, allowing the masses to participate in the political process?
Well, yeah, it is, and I would, I guess, go a step further, and something that I advocated for when I served in Ethiopia, and I assume my successors did, and that's simply a more level political playing field in the country. I used to use that term frequently. Now, you never have a completely level playing field in any country, including the United States, as we have seen even from our last election. There are always going to be anomalies in the electoral process. But the playing field in Ethiopia has been tilted much too far in one direction, and it needs to be leveled out, where voices who don't agree with the government have their ability to speak out. That's why I spent so much time in trying to encourage and strengthening of the private press in Ethiopia during my time. Those are basic, and we talk a lot about free and fair elections. Well, sure, there should be free and fair elections, but there's a definitional problem here. What is a free and fair election? There aren't very many countries in the world that have truly free and fair elections, but you need to move in that direction, and I think that's critical to ultimately resolving the problems, the current political problems in Ethiopia. It's a question of rule of law. It's a question of releasing political detainees, of opening up the media to make it freer, so that all voices are heard. And when those voices are heard, particularly majority voices or plurality voices, then it's incumbent upon them not to discriminate against minorities. And that's a concern I have too. There's not a good history in Ethiopia of one group being fair to minority groups in the country.
Okay. And what do you think would be the way out? I mean, if you were to, what would be your message to the current Ethiopian government and to the people who are trying to change the government? What do you think would be the way out for them right now?
And that's a hard one. It's really not to me to determine what Ethiopians themselves ought to determine for themselves. And to give gratuitous advice from Washington, from someone who's not even in government anymore, is probably a thankless task. I'd be reluctant to offer advice at this point in time, other than what I've already said, that you certainly need to work to level the political playing field and to give those groups that have not been able to have much role in governance a greater opportunity to do so. And when those people eventually get in power, a position of power, to then be sure that they allow opportunity for minority groups in the country. That's about the only general advice I would give.
All right. And I would like to thank you for joining us today. And I would also like to thank our viewers for joining us. Ambassador, it's great to have you here.
My pleasure joining you, and I wish you and your colleagues all the best.
All right. Thanks for, general comments about the discussion today.